A monastery stands on a lonely shore. Peaceful chants rise with the dawn. But suddenly, the air is shattered by war cries. Long wooden ships have landed, dragons at the helm, and from them leap tall, wild warriors with axes in hand. To the terrified monks of 9th century Europe, it must have felt like doomsday had arrived. In fact, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that in 793, strange people appeared in Northumbria. Immense sheets of light rushing through the air, and whirlwinds, fiery dragons flying across the firmament, omens that soon followed by the harrowing inroads of heathen men who made lamentable havoc in the Church of God in Holy Island by rapine and slaughter. A Northumbrian scholar, Alcuin of York, wrote in horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." These contemporary words are quite vivid. They cement the image of the Vikings as an almost supernatural scourge, heathen pirates, so fearsome that even the skies foretold their coming. The tough guys are here, but it's easy to be tough when you're slaughtering a handful of unarmed priests. But were the Vikings really as fearsome and as invincible as their legend and reputation and perhaps stereotype suggests? Maybe, maybe not. That's what we're here to find out. We're going to go on a journey through the Viking Age, from its origins to its decline, and along the way we'll critically assess their reputation as an unstoppable force. We'll hear voices from the Viking side, the sagas, the archaeology, and also from their foes, those Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, along with Frankish annalists, monks, and even observers in the Middle East. We'll get into how these Norse seafarers actually fought, what tactics they used, and whether they really deserved this terrifying renown. And by the end, you may find that the all-conquering Viking is a little more of a overstatement than it is a reality. But the truth, while it is no less fascinating, is far more nuanced. But where are my manners? Welcome to the channel, everyone. For those not subscribed, you better click the subscribe if you feel the need to do so. And thank you to those supporting on the Patreon and those who checked out the merch store. Now, without further ado, let's get nice and comfortable. And as usual, we're going to go slowly and try and understand the topic in the best way we can. Enjoy. Every story has a beginning, and for the Vikings that's no different. It starts in the cold seas and the deep fjords of Scandinavia in the late 8th century. The people who would become infamous as Vikings, as we call them, were not initially united by any king or empire, so to speak. Rather, they were fishermen, farmers, petty chieftains at the top end of things, and of course plenty of traders from what is now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, give or take for some variation in borders. For centuries they had largely fought each other. Local feuds and power struggles between the Scandinavian clans. Fighting was a way of life. But around the 790s, something changed. Why did bands of Norsemen suddenly begin sailing out to raid foreign shores? It's a combination of factors. Overpopulation in their marginal farmlands, political pressure from emerging monarchies. You see, some warriors were exiles or rebels. Economic ambition. hearing tales of wealthy monasteries ripe for plunder, and even climate shifts. One factor was technological. By the 8th century, the Norse had perfected the design of the longship, a swift, sturdy vessel with a shallow draft. They could cross open oceans, but they could also sail up shallow rivers. Now this effectively gave them the supreme naval technology at the time, giving them a permanent edge and the ability to strike wherever they liked without warning. Armed with such equipment, a small crew of raiders found that they could outsail, outmaneuver, and outrun any local defense. Of course, if you are somewhat familiar with Viking history or Anglo-Saxon history, you will notice that in the introduction of the video I was, of course, referring to Lindisfarne. Now, the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, that attack on a Northumbrian holy island, is often cited as the start of the Viking Age, and it's certainly starting off with a bang. It was so shocking because it struck at the heart of Christian Britain's sense of security. Monasteries like Lindisfarne were completely unprepared. They were spiritual sanctuaries. They were not fortresses. And the Vikings brilliantly exploited it. They showed up without any warning on a completely undefended shore, stormed the priory, killed or enslaved the monks, and loaded their ships with treasure, illuminated manuscripts, golden altar pieces, holy relics, whatever they could get their hands on. All of this happened before anyone could mount a rescue attempt. Now, to the Christian world, the heathen had arrived, and their cruelty seemed like nothing before ever seen, perhaps not seen for a long time either. Alcuin scolded the Northumbrian king, blaming moral failings for incurring God's wrath in the form of pagan invaders. But the truth was, from the Viking perspective, Lindisfarne was simply an easy target of opportunity. One might even say that it was just a good business decision, a rich store of valuables guarded only by unarmed monks. From the Viking perspective, it was basically there for the taking, fish in a barrel. Or if the Anglo-Saxons felt so dearly about it, perhaps they should have set some guards. I'm sure that they were quite surprised with how easy it was. The risk to reward was very skewed in their favor. And of course, this set quite a precedent. As one account notes, news of Lindisfarne showed Viking warriors that wealth, slaves, and glory were easily found across the sea. You just have to go and take it. Word spread, and from a small band that randomly landed on the shore, more longships soon followed in its wake. Early Viking raids were typically small-scale, seasonal, hit-and-run affairs. A few dozen men would land, plunder a coastal site, and depart before the local lords could gather a defensive army. This guerrilla-style raiding contributed hugely to their fearsome reputation. They seemed to materialize out of thin air and vanish just as quickly, pockets heavy with loot. In these early decades, 793 through the early 800s, the Norse raiders had an element of surprise and terror on their side. Medieval Christian writers describe Vikings as wolf or dragon-like, descending on the flock of the faithful. A Frankish chronicler compared Northmen to stinging hornets swarming out of a beehive, and lamented that a number of Viking ships was so large that it could not be counted. No doubt, a little bit of hyperbole, but reflective of the panic that they inspired. But we really have to ask, were the Vikings inherently more brutal and warlike than anybody else of their era. Early medieval Europe was no stranger to violence, surely. Franks, Avars, Saxons, Bulgars, Arabs, they all had their share of fierce raiders. So what set the Vikings apart initially? It was where and who they attacked. They struck at wealthy but defenseless places, especially monasteries and churches, and there were outsiders, pagans. They didn't follow the moral constraints of Christian warfare. To the monks writing the chronicles, this made the Vikings' deeds loom large and appear even more evil. The very word Viking in Old Norse means a pirate or raider, suggesting it was an activity, rather a doing word, rather than an ethnicity. Not all Scandinavians went a Viking, as they would call it, but those who did quickly learned that raiding was a pretty good career move. Now let's step back from the fearful perspective of the victims for a moment, and consider the Vikings themselves. How exactly did they fight, and why was their technique so effective? At least, for a time, but we'll get to that. Of course, far from being mindless berserkers, though we'll get to those tales in a moment too. Viking warbands were organized and shrewd. The greatest advantage was mobility and surprise. With their longships, they could strike almost anywhere near water, coasts, riverbanks, inland via estuaries, and withdraw swiftly. Kingdoms like England or Carolingian France, lacking fast communications or standing navies, often could not respond in time. The Vikings chose the time and place of the fight, a huge tactical edge. In the battle itself, Vikings typically fought on foot as heavy infantry. Despite popular images of fur-clad barbarians, many Viking raiders wore sturdy linen or woolen tunics, carried wooden round shields, and were armed with iron weapons common to the age. Spears, swords, and don't forget the iconic Danish battle axe, a two-handed axe with a long haft and broad blade that could cleave a skull or limb with terrifying efficiency at that. More high-ranking or wealthy Vikings might wear a shirt of mail, that is chainmail armor, and an iron helmet, and not with horns, by the way. I hope I don't have to mention it. Sorry for all the Minnesota football fans listening, but the actual Viking helmets were conical and rounded and sometimes had a simple nose guard. In fact, wearing those horns into battle, just think of the impracticality of it. It might have been a little bit intimidating, sure, but well, it mainly came from old opera depictions, things like this. It's a bit of a myth. In fact, only one of the only intact Viking helmets discovered, the Gjermundbu helmet from Norway, has a spectacled eye guard and no horns at all. Axes, swords, and Sikhs' knives were their close combat tools, while bows and arrows could be used to pepper an enemy from a distance, if required. Now they did not, in the pagan era, generally fight on horseback, though they sometimes stole horses to ride off after a raid. In pitched battle, they usually formed a shield wall, much like their Anglo-Saxon or Frankish foes, a formation where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping in front, creating a wall of wood and iron. From behind this wall they would thrust spears and hack with swords or axes. The clash of two shield walls was a brutal hand-to-hand combat. It was a test of cohesion and courage all at once. So were the Vikings better fighters than others? Well, they were certainly experienced, and often highly motivated by the prospects of plunder or glory. In many cases, especially early on, they had the advantage of the battle-hardened leaders, Many legendary Viking captains had spent years raiding around Europe, honing their tactics. They also benefited from a psychological edge. Their ferocity and the fear that they generated could certainly weaken the resolve of anyone they attacked. The reputation of the Vikings sometimes fought for them, you see. Defenders who had heard tales of churches burned and innocents violently slaughtered might break and flee rather than face the same treatment. The Vikings, for their part, sometimes cultivated this fearsome image. Old Norse sagas speak of the berserkers, warriors who fought in a trance-like state, a kind of blood-drunk fury, said to be mad as wolves or dogs, biting their shields even, and completely immune to pain. These berserkers, from the actual word berserker, perhaps meaning bare shirt or bare shirt as in B-A-R-E, implying wild warriors who fought without armor. They're semi-legendary, but likely some Viking warriors did work themselves into a frenzy through ritual, intoxicants, or perhaps sheer will, intimidating enemies and to ignore wounds. In fact, an Icelandic saga recounts such warrior. One such warrior, Egil Skallagrimsson, who in a duel threw aside his sword and, I quote, went at his opponent with his teeth, biting through his throat. Good Lord. Well, whether or not such moments are embellished, they contributed to the mythos of the Viking invincibility. Wow. However, let's not idealize it too much in terms of their prowess. Viking tactics are highly effective for raiding and skirmishing, sure, but in set-piece battles against disciplined armies, they weren't always so tough. They had no monopoly on the shield wall or the axe. Anglo-Saxon housecarls, the royal bodyguards, also wielded huge axes to deadly effect, for instance. If anything, one could argue Vikings were conventional fighters of their age in battle, distinguished more by their mobility and boldness than by radically different military technique. One advantage they often enjoyed was leadership and unity of purpose in their war bands, being mostly volunteer or semi-volunteer forces bound by loyalty to a charismatic chieftain. They often had high morale and camaraderie, and the shared identity of being a Norseman, and often far from home, meant that each man relied on the others for success and survival. We should also mention the naval warfare aspect. Vikings could indeed fight on water. There are accounts of Viking fleets battling local navies, or just other Vikings. They would lash their long ships together to create a stable fighting platform, and then engage in archery duels or boarding actions. Their experience as sailors made them confident in amphibious operations, something their opponents rarely matched early on. Of course, all these elements combined certainly make them seem unstoppable, don't you think? At least during the 9th century. But as we shall see, the further the Vikings ventured, and the longer they stayed, the more their weaknesses became apparent. Cracks were beginning to show. They were humans after all, cunning and courageous, sure, but they weren't magical demons from hell. As other societies adapted to the Viking threat, the playing field suddenly began to level out. From the 790s through the 9th century, Viking raids expanded in their scope and therefore ambition. No longer content with the smash-and-grab raids, larger Viking armies began to form and set their sights on major kingdoms. Nowhere was this more dramatic than in the British Isles, Anglo-Saxon England in the mid-9th century was a patchwork of kingdoms: Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria, Wessex, and they were often at odds with each other. The Vikings knew this very well, and they exploited this political division. In 890, or 865 rather, a coalition of Danish Viking chiefs, the legendary Great Heathen Army. Well, you've got to give them that. It's a cool name for an army, isn't it? Landed in East Anglia, but not just to raid. This time, they were there to conquer and settle. They came in force, perhaps a few thousand strong, and methodically went about defeating Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, picking them off one by one. Northumbria fell, with its capital, York, in those days called Jorvik, becoming a Viking stronghold. East Anglia's king, Edmund, famously met a grisly end. Later narratives said that the Vikings tied him to a tree and shot him full of arrows when he refused to renounce his faith. Thus, he became St. Edmund the Martyr. Mercia was destabilized. By 870, only Wessex, under the young King Alfred, remained as a bulwark against the complete Norse domination of England. Something had to be done. Alfred, after some desperate guerrilla resistance, including a legendary winter hiding in the marshes and nearly being defeated, managed to rally the West Saxons. He reorganized defenses, building fortified towns called burhs, and a mobile army that could respond quickly. In 878, at the Battle of Edington, Alfred won a decisive victory against Guthrum, one of the Viking kings. The defeated Vikings were compelled to make peace and even accept Christian baptism. England would thereafter be divided between the Danelaw, areas of the north and east under Viking control, and the Anglo-Saxon south and west. This period shows Vikings at both their most dominant, but also their most challenged. Sure, they overran entire kingdoms, and that's pretty terrifying, but Alfred's successes demonstrate that when the leaders adapted to Viking tactics, those invaders could indeed be beaten. Alfred wisely avoided open field battles, unless conditions favored him completely, and he used a network of fortresses to deny the Vikings easy plunder. The myth of Viking invincibility began to crack. By the early 900s, Alfred's descendants were on the offensive, slowly reconquering the Danelaw. Far from always being dominant, some Viking armies were essentially bottled up, and some were bribed to leave. In fact, that happened in France repeatedly, those days called Francia. Now, speaking of Francia, by the way, the Vikings ravaged the Frankish or Carolingian Empire throughout the 9th century too. Dozens of Norse fleets prowled the rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, striking at cities like Rouen, Nantes, Hamburg, and even Paris itself. Frankish chronicles bitterly record year after year after year of Viking attacks. In 845, a fleet led by the notorious Viking chieftain Regenerus, Ragnar, perhaps semi-legendary, sailed up the Seine and laid siege to Paris itself. Just imagine the shock in the court of the refined Frankish King Charles the Bold. These barbarians had penetrated the very heart of his empire. Well, Charles was unable to dislodge them, and there was only one way to get them to leave: paying them about 7,000 livres of silver. That made them eventually go away, an event that introduced the word Danegeld, literally Dane payment, into history. While the Vikings left with their silver, such payoffs only emboldened them to return to more. In 885 to 886, Vikings besieged Paris again. a massive onslaught, famously described by a monk named Arbo. The city's garrison, led by Count Odo, withstood months of attacks. The Parisians even dumped burning oil and wax on the Vikings, scalding their walls. Ultimately, the siege lifted, not purely by force, but again by negotiation and payoff, and by the arrival of Charles the Fat's army. Frankish policy vacillated between fighting and buying off the Vikings. The Viking leader, Rollo, was such a thorn in northwestern Francia that in 911 the Frankish king Charles the Simple made a deal. He granted Rollo and his men land in Neustria, that is the region around Rouen, in exchange for protecting it from other raiders. Thus was born Normandy, the land of the Northmen, with the Viking warlord becoming duke and owing nominal loyalty to the king. In the long run, this quieting by settlement strategy proved to be effective. Rollo and his descendants went from pagan raiders to Christian lords, founders of a principality that would in time produce the Normans, who ironically would launch their own invasion of England in 1066, but hey, that's another story for another time, I suppose. So during the height of their raids in the west, Vikings indeed seemed to be pretty much everywhere. Monastic writers in France wrote of towns burned, abbeys looted, and people carried off into slavery. They often emphasized the Vikings' cruelty, killing clergy, ravaging women, desecrating churches. Some of this is undoubtedly true, sure. Vikings were certainly not gentle house guests, though some of it might be embellished as typical of war narratives. But the fear, that was real. You wouldn't make that up. The coastal village sometimes just emptied at the sight of the Viking ships. The Vikings exploited rivers as highways deep inland, reaching even far-off places, like cities within Germany, and attacking as far south as northern Italy. In 844, a Viking fleet even sacked Lisbon. At that time, an Islamic-ruled city in Al-Andalus, by the way, and in 859 another Viking group purportedly reached the gates of Rome, though, in fact, they raided a town in Italy thinking it was Rome. The psychological impact of such wide-ranging attacks was, of course, immense. Yet not every Viking raid was successful. For example, in Ireland, the Vikings, called Dubgail and Fingail by the Irish, meaning dark and fair foreigners, established bases like Dublin, but they met stiff resistance from Irish kings. The Irish annals recorded battles where Viking forces were defeated as often as they won. In 1014, the Battle of Clontarf near Dublin saw the Irish king Brian Boru fight an alliance of Dublin Norse and their Irish allies. The battle was bloody, thousands falling on each side, including Brian himself. But by most accounts, the north side was shattered, and Viking power in Ireland afterwards began to wane. While Clontarf didn't end the Vikings in Ireland, if we're going to use that terminology, as Norse communities in Dublin and coastal towns persisted and assimilated, it certainly showed that the Vikings could be decisively beaten by local rulers who mustered an equal force. The fearsome fighters had their share of failures too. So in Western Europe, the Vikings were a scourge, yes, but over time, their narrative shifts from relentless conquest to integration or defeat. England by 950 was largely back under English kings, albeit with a strong Viking influence in culture and bloodline in the Danelaw. In Francia, by the 940s, the worst was pretty much over, and the Northmen had either been bought off, killed, or absorbed, Normandy's rulers being vassals rather than foes. The monastic chroniclers, who in 841 wrote, "The Viking ships are without number," in despair, by the late 10th century, wrote more about the new problem of other invaders or internal wars. The Vikings have been fearsome, sure, but not invincibly, not uniformly, and not forever. But the Vikings didn't only plague the Christian North. With typical audacity, they also thrust into the heart of the South, into Muslim-ruled Spain, Al-Andalus, and the Mediterranean Sea, regions that likely never expected to see Norse raiders. In 844, a Viking fleet of perhaps 50 ships sailed from their bases in Francia down the Atlantic coast to Iberia. They raided the coasts of what is now Portugal and Spain, sacking cities like Lisbon and Cadiz, and then boldly sailed up the Guadalquivir River to Seville, one of the richest cities in the Emirates of Cordoba. The Arabic Chronicles was astonished, as the Christians had been in 793. The Vikings, who the Muslims called al-Majus, fire worshippers or pagans, actually captured Seville for a short time in October 844. The city had no walls and was caught completely off guard. So imagine the blonde, armored-up northerners rampaging in the marketplaces of Seville. It must have been somewhat bewildering for the locals of Al-Andalus. But the Arab response was swift and formidable. The Emir Abd al-Rahman II gathered an army, including elite cavalry, and counterattacked. In a pitched battle outside of Seville, the Andalusian forces absolutely mopped the floor with the Vikings, inflicting heavy losses on them, many of whom were executed in full view of their retreating compatriots. The Vikings were killed, captured, or driven back to their boats. Reportedly, scores of Vikings were beheaded or hung from the city walls as a grim warning. The few who survived fled, some sources say even converting to Islam to be spared, and then serving as mercenaries for the emir. The people of Seville were traumatized by the raid, but they certainly learned from it. Might be time to build that wall. The emirate built up a navy and improved coastal defenses after 844, determined to never let the Vikings catch them unprepared again. Indeed, when the Vikings returned in later years, they were often repulsed by the new Muslim fleet in the Strait of Gibraltar. And one could actually argue the Iberian and North African powers responded to Vikings faster and more effectively than many Christian realms did, likely because they had experience dealing with seaborne forces and could mobilize resources quicker under a centralized state. Nevertheless, some Vikings did continue to prowl the Mediterranean. In 859 to 861, a large Viking expedition led by chieftains Hastin and Bjorn Ironside sailed from West Francia through Gibraltar, raiding as they went, and into the western Mediterranean. They plundered the Balearic Islands, attacked the coasts of North Africa, and then turned north to what is now France and Italy. We have a colourful tale, perhaps apocryphal. In the sagas and chronicles, it tells us how Hastin, coveting the glory of sacking Rome, led his Vikings to attack a city in Italy. Unsure of how to breach its walls, the crafty Hastin feigned illness and death, even staging a funeral procession to get his men inside the gates, only to leap from his coffin and help his men sack the town. Unfortunately for Hastin, the town was not Rome at all. Some say it was actually the city of Luna. Now, this anecdote, true or not, it captures a combination of audacity and cunning in Viking raid behavior. If anything, it's creative, we'll give them that. These Mediterranean forays show Vikings as far-ranging freebooters. But interestingly, they didn't establish lasting colonies in the south, with one exception actually being a short-lived settlement in Carmagé in France, and later the Normans in Italy who were descendants of the Vikings rather than new arrivals, sure. The climate, stronger states, and naval patrols made the Mediterranean less hospitable to repeat Viking incursions. By the 10th century, the heyday of Viking activity in the south was all but over, but they'd certainly left a mark. In fact, you may find a few Norse coins scattered around, but the fear they instilled was fleeting compared to the generations of fear in the north. While Viking raids pounded Western Europe, another stream of Norse adventurers went eastward into the rivers of modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. These were mainly Swedes, often called Varangians or Rus, and their purpose was often more trade than raid, though the line could blur. They traveled down the great waterways like the Volga and the Dnieper, navigating the river and portage, linking to the Baltic and the Black and Caspian seas. In the process, they founded trading settlements that would eventually grow into cities, Novgorod, Kiev, and interacted with the Slavic, Finnic, and Turkic peoples. The indigenous chronicles of the Eastern Slavs even credit a group of Norse called the Rus with founding the polity of Kievan Rus, basically the beginnings of Russia and Ukraine, under a leader named Rurik, around 862. To the Byzantine Greeks and the Muslim Arabs, these northern visitors were somewhat of a curiosity. They were known to be tall, fair-haired, heavily armed men coming to trade amber, furs, honey, and even slaves for silver and fine goods. But occasionally, they too came as raiders. The city of Constantinople was attacked by Rus Vikings in 860, a daring strike on the world's richest metropolis. Well, it ultimately failed as the Vikings withdrew, perhaps satisfied with some plunder from the surrounding suburbs. Later Rus attacks on Constantinople in the 10th century were repelled by the Byzantium war machine, which famously included Greek fire, by the way, a kind of ancient/medieval napalm. Eventually, the Byzantines found it more useful to employ the Norse warriors than to fight them, giving rise to the Varangian Guard, an elite corps of Scandinavian and later Anglo-Saxon mercenaries who served as the personal guard of the Byzantine emperors. These Varangians earned a reputation in the East for being fiercely loyal as hired hands, and just as ferocious in battle, often wielding those huge, threatening axes. One Byzantine princess, Anna Komnena, writing later, described the Varangians as fearsome, gigantic men, their axes gleaming. The mystique of the Viking warrior persisted long after their age, transplanted into imperial service. Even further east, Norse explorers reached the Muslim world of the Middle East. The most famous account comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab envoy, who encountered a group of Viking Rus on the Volga River in 922. His detailed observations provide a rare outsider perspective on the Vikings. He was simultaneously impressed, but also disgusted. On one hand, he noted, "I've never seen more perfect physiques than theirs, like palm trees, fair and reddish. They were tall, blonde or red-haired, heavily tattooed and armed to the teeth, a striking sight for a scholar from Baghdad." But then he also calls them the filthiest of all Allah's creature, appalled by their hygiene, going on to say, "They do not purify themselves after excreting or urinating, nor do they wash after coitus. They do not even wash their hands after meals." He describes how Rus Vikings would wash their faces and blow their noses into a communal basin of water, one after another each morning, without even changing the water. Oh, good Lord. A practice that made the clean-loving Muslim wretch. Yeah, that's not good. We certainly have an intriguing contrast, don't we? To the Arabs, the Northmen were physically formidable, but culturally completely barbaric. Ibn Fadlan also famously records a Viking funeral of a chieftain. The dead lord's ship was pulled aside, his body placed inside with treasures, and a slave girl, voluntarily or perhaps under influence, sacrificed to join him in the afterlife. Her body burned with him on the ship. Such accounts confirmed the Vikings' reputation for savagery, but also showed a side of ritual and honor, albeit through a pretty gruesome lens. In terms of fighting, when Vikings clashed with powers in the east, the outcomes were mixed. The Khazar Kaganet, a Turkic state in the Caucasus, and the Volga Bulgars at times blocked Rus' expansion or extracted tolls from them. The mighty Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, was largely beyond the reach of these northern raiders except via trade. Indeed, the flow of Arab silver coins into Scandinavia during the Viking Age shows that many Norse were more interested in commerce than combat in the east. But the Vikings did manage some dramatic raids. For instance, a group of Rus Vikings sailed all the way across the Caspian Sea and attacked present-day parts of Azerbaijan and Iran in the 10th century, believe it or not. Of course, they met with quite a harsh fate. The local Muslim armies trapped and annihilated many of them. Another reminder that when far from their element or facing strong forces, Vikings could and would be wiped out. So across northern Europe into North Africa and the Middle East, Vikings made their presence felt. Fearsome, sure. If you were a merchant on the Volga seeing these wild Norse raiders, or a Spanish villager seeing a dragon-prowed ship on the horizon, you'd be terrified. But in each theater, the Vikings eventually met their match, or melted into the local fabric. In the east, many Viking Rus became Slavicized, embracing Slavic language and culture and founding dynasties, the ancestors of the Russian princes. In the Islamic world, the Vikings either met a quick defeat or settled into roles as traders and guards. The world reacted to the Viking threat, sometimes with brutal force, sometimes with assimilation. And the Vikings, for all their ferocity, in the end had no choice but to adapt or perish. So we've talked about a broad range of Viking exploits. But for a moment pause and consider the battle effectiveness in hindsight. The Viking reputation as universally dominant warriors, it doesn't perfectly square up with the historical record. They were exceptional in some ways. Ships and seafaring skills were second to none in that era, allowing them to project force in ways that others could not, at least for the time being. Early on, this gave them an almost unfair advantage. Coastal and riverside targets were simply low-hanging fruit. Their courage and aggression meant they could often take the initiative in combat, dictating terms. A Viking raider band fresh off a longship, fighting on its own terms, was indeed a terror to militia and villagers. However, when the Vikings faced organized, prepared military opposition, the results could really go either way. They often won if they caught the enemies by surprise or if morale broke, psychological impacts of their onslaught again. But if the enemy stood firm, as for example, the Anglo-Saxon feared army, that's F-Y-R-D by the way, did at the Battle of Ashdown in 871 under Alfred's brother, or as the Irish did at Clontarf in 1014, the Vikings could and did lose on the battlefield. Consider one legendary example at the end of the Viking Age, the Battle of Stamford Bridge, 1066 in England. Here the famed Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, often called the last great Viking, invaded England with a sizable force. Initially he defeated an English northern army at Fulford, but then King Harold Godwinson of England, himself somewhat ironically of mixed Anglo-Danish blood, rushed his army north and caught Hardrada's Vikings by surprise at Stamford Bridge. The Norse, many not even wearing armor due to a warm day, suddenly saw a well-armed English force bearing down. According to the chronicles, as the Vikings attempted to retreat across a narrow bridge, one giant-like Norse axeman stayed behind to single-handedly delay the English army. This lone warrior allegedly cut down up to 40 Saxons by himself, holding the choke point so effectively that the English had to use trickery. One soldier floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust his spear up through the planks, killing the Viking from beneath. Seems like some sort of Donkey Kong sort of thing, doesn't it? What's going on there? Well, either way, it's a testament to individual Viking bravery, and the English admired it too, but also a prelude to what happened next. Once across the bridge, Harold's English housecarls formed their own shield wall and charged Hardrada's host. The Vikings formed a line and they forced fiercely. Hardrada himself reportedly went berserk too, wielding a two-handed sword and singing war songs, until an arrow struck him in the throat. The battle raged for hours, but ultimately the English broke the Viking shield wall, and they were utterly routed. Of an invasion force that had arrived in 300 ships, so many Norse died that only 24 ships were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. Stamford Bridge was a bloody affair that showed even the mightiest of Vikings could be outmaneuvered and outmatched under the right circumstance. But of course, if you know the history, fate had a twist. Harold Godwinson had won this battle, but then he had to race south and was defeated by the Normans at Hastings just a few weeks later. So the Viking Age eventually gave way to a new era of Norman kings. Of course, if Godwinson had not had to fight Hardrada up in the north, who knows how the Battle of Hastings would have went. Now the point is, the Vikings were not unbeatable superhumans. They bled and died, just like any other mortal warrior. Their victories often came from exploiting weaknesses, surprise, dividing opponents, undefended targets, intimidation, rather from an overwhelming superiority in arms, tactics, or numbers. But I suppose that is just the art of war. But as their enemies learned and adapted, Viking advantages began to dwindle. Fortified towns denied them easy plunder. Standing armies and fleets denied them freedom of movement. And even culturally, once the Vikings began settling in lands, England, Normandy, Ireland, Russia, they tended to assimilate and just lose that taste, the wanderlust that fueled their raiding for so many years. A settled Viking farmer in York or Dublin was less likely to launch a raid on his neighbors, especially after converting to Christianity, which removed that ideological us versus them aspect that originally made monasteries fair game. And so, by the mid-11th century, the Viking Age was winding down. There's a few factors that contributed to the decline. First is the Christianization of Scandinavia. During the 900s, the kings of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden gradually adopted Christianity. You've seen the flags. With this came new alliances and a new world view. When Christian Danes and Norwegians certainly fought wars, of course, Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Canute conquered England in 1013 to 1016, but as would-be kings, not hit-and-run raiders. The old pattern of raiding monastic sites purely for pagan glory had faded. It's harder to justify plundering a monastery when you share the same faith, or when you know the neighboring Christian kings will retaliate in force. The church also likely worked to pacify and integrate warrior elites into more respectable forms of warfare, feudal service, crusades, royal armies, that sort of thing. And then we have the formation of strong kingdoms. In Scandinavia itself, centralized kingdoms emerged. In Denmark under Harald Bluetooth and Svein Forkbeard, in Norway under Harald Fairhair and later Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, in Sweden under Olaf Skotkonung. These kings realized that maintaining internal stability and profiting from taxation and trade could be far more rewarding than the risky business of raiding. Well, as we've detailed, countries that have been victims also toughened up. England under kings like Aethelstan, and later the resolute Anglo-Saxon kings of the 10th century, became capable of repelling Viking forces, until a new wave of Danish kings took over. But even that became a dynastic union rather than a devastation. After Canute the Great, a Danish king, ruled England, Denmark, and Norway in the 1020s, the idea of a Viking conquering England was not frightening, but rather politically normalized. In 1066, when Hardrada tried to conquer England in the old Viking way, he failed. And ironically, the successful conqueror of England that year was William of Normandy, a descendant of Vikings who fought in the feudal style with knights and castles all along. Europe's age of castle building had begun, and medieval castles was something a band of Vikings in longships really couldn't do much against. Coastal defenses and local militias also improved. The element of surprise had diminished. People knew what to watch out for, and beacons were set up and could be lit to warn of the Viking sails. So did the Vikings really deserve their fearsome reputation? In the eyes of their contemporaries, absolutely. The trauma and destruction they inflicted was very real. Monks writing in the annals of 800 or 850 were not exaggerating when they described the Vikings as a cruel scourge. In their experience, they certainly were. I mean, imagine being a peaceful monk or peasant and seeing your entire home burned, your friends and family killed or enslaved. You'd certainly spread the story of those nightmarish invaders too, wouldn't you? Their broad geographical scope of operations was unprecedented. From Newfoundland in the west, yes, they briefly settled in North America around 1000 AD too, though fighting with the indigenous people who they called Skreelings caused them to retreat. To the Caspian Sea in the east, from the Arctic Circle down to North Africa, the Vikings ranged farther, and perhaps any other pre-modern European people did. This fueled stories and rumors that enhanced the ferocious image. To Western Christians, they were pagan devils. To Muslims of Spain, they were a strange, wild people from the north. To the Byzantines, hardy barbarians, useful as guards. Each viewed them with a lens of fear and utility. However, with our view in hindsight, we see the Vikings as people, a dynamic, exploratory, opportunistic people at that. In battle they had their share of brilliant victories and ignoble defeats. We've seen them triumph, capture kingdoms, besiege great cities, and we've seen them vanquished, cut down by cavalry in Spain, outsmarted in England, absorbed in France. They were not immortal, invulnerable titans. Their dominance was not always or everywhere. It was situational, and often temporary. The Vikings met stronger opponents in the Arab armies and the Byzantine legions, and even their most triumphant arena, Britain and Ireland, they eventually met their match, merged with locals sometimes too. By 1100, Scandinavians were Christianized, and Europe no longer feared Viking raids. Instead, Scandinavian kings were just another part of European politics. In fact, by the 12th century, some former Vikings, the Normans, were ironically crusading against other pagans or Muslims, seeing themselves now as civilized Christians. So to answer the question, were the Vikings really as fearsome, as tough, as people think they are? Yes and no. Yes, in terms of the terror they struck into the hearts of the monks and the peasants with their sudden raids, and in the saga's portrayal of the mighty warriors who laughed at death, and that's earned them a reputation as ferocious fighters, that's for sure. They leveraged their technology, bold tactics, and sheer cunning to leave an outsized mark on history. But, no, they were not an all-conquering master race that rolled over every opponent with ease. They had weaknesses, a lack of cavalry, limited siege capability. They weren't great at taking fortified cities by force. Relatively small numbers compared to large armies of established kingdoms. Sometimes lacked a strategic long-term plan. Many just came for the loot, not to build an empire. Once their initial edge was blunted, the Vikings could be, and were, defeated by determined foes. Their dominance in battle was real, sure, but not uniform. It shone brightly in surprise raids and early incursions, but then dimmed as the element of surprise faded. So I hope that answered your question. Well, I suppose it was my question, posed to you. I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitimus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfenir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, the HMSHH, Crystal, and Talvery. Thank you very much for listening. I invite you to hit the like and subscribe. Check out the Patreon and the merch store. And with that, I leave you for this evening, or whatever time it is wherever you are, and I will see you in the next video. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.